The first time Deidra Ellingsworth knocked on my door, she was holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Mr. Mason Trubell," she said, squinting at me like I was a bug on her windshield. "We need to talk about your barn." It was 7 in the morning. I hadn't even finished my coffee. My barn, painted red, modest size, tucked behind my house, was my pride and joy. I built it with my own hands last spring. Used reclaimed wood, leveled it myself, even installed solar panels on the roof. I kept a few old bikes in there, my tractor, and a couple of rescued chickens. "What about it?" I asked, stepping out onto the porch in my work boots. She didn't answer right away. Just stared at it from my driveway like it had personally offended her. "It violates HOA code," she finally declared, flipping a page on her clipboard. "You didn't submit a request for structure modification, and it's unsightly. The thing looked like it belonged on the cover of a homesteading magazine." "I didn't need HOA approval," I said. "I checked with the county before I built it." "It's legal, zoned, and meets all structural requirements," she sniffed. "Well, it doesn't meet our standards," I crossed my arms. "It's on my land, outside your jurisdiction." Her eyes narrowed. "Our jurisdiction covers the entire subdivision, including your lot." "You signed the covenant when you bought here." "I didn't actually. My property sat right at the edge of the neighborhood, technically grandfathered in. The original deed never included the HOA, but Deidra had been trying to rope me in for years." "Not interested, Deidra," I said, and turned to go back inside. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, a bright orange violation notice was taped to my barn door. It looked official, stamped with the HOA's logo and everything, but the wording was off. They quoted some vague architectural compliance clause and demanded I dismantle the structure within 10 days or face escalating fines. I called the county inspector that afternoon. His name was Jerry, and he remembered signing off on the plans. "She's full of it," he said, flipping through his folder. "You're in the clear. That barn is completely legal. She doesn't have any authority over your property." "Mind putting that in writing?" I asked. 2 days later, I had the signed letter from the county, stamped and notarized. I made 5 copies and taped them all over the barn. That's when things got weird. Next morning, I found that someone had spray-painted "code violation" across the side of the barn in big white letters. My security camera caught the whole thing. Grainy footage, but clear enough to recognize the figure, Deidra. Hoodie, flashlight, and a can of paint in hand. I copied the footage to a flash drive and walked straight to the sheriff's office. They watched the video twice. "Let me guess," the deputy said. "HOA president, acting president," I said. "No one ever votes, she just kind of took over." He shook his head. "Typical. Vandalism's a chargeable offense. We'll look into it." I left the station with a copy of the report and a quiet satisfaction in my chest. But I should have known Deidra wasn't done. The next sign that things were escalating came in the form of a certified letter, slid under my front door in a manila envelope. No postage, no return address. Just a folded letterhead stamped with the same HOA logo I'd already grown tired of seeing. It wasn't a fine this time, it was a cease and desist. They accused me of interfering with HOA operations and spreading defamatory information, citing the footage I gave to the sheriff's office. Apparently, Deidra had learned the hard way that vandalism doesn't mix well with solar-powered security cameras. And now, instead of owning up to it, she was doubling down. I unfolded the letter on the kitchen counter, reading each sentence twice. According to them, I was harassing a board member during the performance of her duties by reporting her to law enforcement. They demanded I cease all retaliatory actions, or they'd pursue civil litigation for reputational damages. I almost laughed. That barn was my property. The footage was mine, and Deidra had no more right to paint on it than I had to show up at her house with a can of tar. I called my cousin Colleen that afternoon. She worked in real estate law over in Charleston and owed me a favor after I helped her fix up her deck last summer. "They're bluffing," she said as she skimmed the letter through a PDF I emailed her. You're not under their jurisdiction, and even if you were, reporting criminal behavior to the sheriff isn't defamation, it's called being a citizen. I could hear her typing. But the letter itself. That's interesting. They're using legal phrasing, but there's no law firm listed, no bar number, no signature from an attorney. What does that mean? It means she probably wrote it herself using a template from the internet. She paused. Want me to check if they've filed anything in small claims, please? An hour later, she called back. Nothing on the docket, but something did come up. Guess who filed for a zoning variance last week? I sat up straighter. You're kidding. Nope, Homeowners Association of Ridgeview Estates. They're trying to incorporate your street into their coverage map, retroactively. That explained the sudden surge of attention. Deidra was playing a long game, trying to drag our street into their domain by petitioning the Planning Commission. If she pulled it off, she'd get control over property taxes, architectural reviews, even enforceable liens. And my barn. That was just the first domino. I drove to the county clerk's office the next day and requested a copy of the petition. It was 5 pages long, buried in legal jargon, but 2 things stood out immediately. First, it claimed unanimous support from affected residents. And second, it listed my address under the agreement section. I raised an eyebrow at the clerk behind the glass. Did these signatures get verified? I asked. He leaned over the counter. We don't verify unless someone files a challenge. Well, someone's about to. I signed the form to file a formal objection and took a copy of the petition with me. Back home, I examined the signature next to my name. It was neat, cursive, and definitely not mine. I write in block letters, always have. I pulled out a copy of my mortgage documents for comparison. The difference was obvious forgery and not just mine. I walked down the street that evening, knocking on doors. A few neighbors brushed me off, but 3 of them Mr. Kim, the retired Navy guy with the flagpole, Mrs. Langston, who ran the local animal shelter, and a young couple named Marcus and Tasha let me in and showed me the same thing. Signatures on the petition that weren't theirs. This is fraud, Marcus said, holding the page up to the light. I never signed anything for the HOA. We moved here to get away from them. I wouldn't mind being part of it, Mrs. Langston said, if they'd asked, but they didn't. That's the problem. I told them about Deidra's attempt to claim my barn violated code, the spray paint, the fake legal letter, and now this. One by one, I saw recognition dawn on their faces. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she'd targeted, just the loudest. By the end of the week, I had notarized statements from 6 neighbors who confirmed their signatures were forged. I submitted them to the Planning Commission along with a request for a formal investigation. Then, I contacted the local news. Channel 9 sent a reporter named Ellie to my place the following Monday. She was young, sharp, and had a voice made for headlines. You think the HOA forged these documents to gain control of your street? She asked, holding the mic out while the cameraman adjusted focus. I don't think, I said. I know, and I've got proof. I showed her the footage of the spray paint incident, the forged petition, the letter from the county inspector verifying my barn's legality. I even gave her a copy of the fake cease and desist. That night, the story aired across the region. Homeowners accuse local HOA of forgery and harassment, the headline read. My barn was in the background, gleaming in the sunset. The response was immediate. The sheriff's office opened a full investigation. Deidra was asked to appear for questioning. And the Planning Commission froze the incorporation request pending review. But Deidra, being Deidra, didn't go quietly. The following morning, 2 uniformed HOA volunteers showed up on my lawn with clipboards and a laminated badge that looked like it was printed at Kinko's. They tried to take photos of my barn again. I stepped out and stood between them and the structure. You're trespassing, I said. We're documenting code violations, one of them replied, a guy in his 50s with a Bluetooth earpiece and an expression that said he took this gig way too seriously. There is no violation, and this isn't your property. He looked uncertain, but the other one, a woman with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, raised her phone anyway. I raised mine too and started recording. "Unless you have a warrant or a legal right to be here, I suggest you leave," I said. They hesitated, then retreated down the driveway without a word. I sent the video to the sheriff's office and added it to a Google Drive folder I'd started labeled HOA escalation evidence. 2 days later, an official notice was posted on the neighborhood entrance sign. "Pending investigation, all HOA activities are temporarily suspended." For the first time since I'd moved in, I saw neighbors gathering in driveways, talking in small knots. People who'd kept to themselves were suddenly trading stories. A retired teacher named Helen told me Deidra once threatened to fine her for keeping a rose trellis too close to the sidewalk. A mechanic named Rob said she tried to block him from parking his work truck in his own driveway. "She told me it lowered property values," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "I told her I raise my own value, thank you very much." Apparently, this was a powder keg waiting for a match, and that match was the barn. The final straw came with a subpoena, not for me, for Deidra. Forgery, vandalism, and filing false documents with a government office are all crimes. Real ones. The sheriff's office had enough statements and evidence to pursue charges. She was served at her own front door, right in front of 2 other board members. One of them quit the HOA that same day. The Planning Commission not only denied the incorporation request, they referred the matter to the state attorney's office. Turns out, fabricating neighborhood consensus isn't just unethical. It's a Class D felony when you do it to manipulate zoning laws. And just like that, the empire Deidra built on threats, forged signatures, and fake authority began to crumble. The doorbell rang just after sunrise. A uniformed officer stood on my porch, notepad tucked under one arm. "Mr. Trubell?" he asked. I nodded. "We've got a warrant to search the Ridgeview HOA office. We understand you filed the original complaint." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "That's right. What's the angle?" He lowered his voice. One of the board members came forward, said there's a storage unit full of altered petitions, falsified documents, even surveillance logs on residents. Surveillance logs, handwritten notes, timestamps, photos taken without consent. Looks like the HOA's been keeping tabs on the neighborhood for years. We're executing the search now. Thought you'd want to know. I followed him to the curb where 2 sheriff's cruisers idled across from the HOA's rented office space. It was a gray prefab unit near the golf course, with a plastic sign that tried too hard to look official. Officers moved in and out, carrying file boxes and hard drives wrapped in evidence tape. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from Detective Alondra Velez at the county precinct. "She kept physical files?" I asked, watching her flip through a binder. 17 of them, she said. "Color-coded, one for each household in the target zone, your name's on the red tab." She turned the binder so I could see. My name was printed in black marker across the top of a manila divider. Behind it were pages of typed notes, dates when I'd mowed my lawn, when my porch light was on, even the exact time I'd parked my truck each morning. "That's unhinged," I said. "It gets worse." There's an envelope labeled Strategy Trubell. Inside are screenshots of your property lines, a map with highlighter marks, and a note that says, "Apply pressure via code enforcement. If denied, initiate petition override." I leaned back in the chair. "She planned the whole thing months in advance," Velez nodded. "This wasn't just over a barn. She was running a long con targeting properties on the edge of the subdivision to expand HOA control and inflate dues. She faked signatures, submitted fraudulent petitions, and tried to use code violations as leverage. Is anyone else facing charges? 2 board members signed off on expense reports for legal threats that were never reviewed by any attorney. Another one approved surveillance equipment using HOA funds cameras hidden in fake birdhouses. My mouth went dry. "Wait, she planted those around the neighborhood?" Velez slid a photo across the table, a close-up of a birdhouse nailed to a utility pole. Inside the opening, a tiny lens was visible. 3 were found on your street alone, she said. 1 directly across from your driveway. I stared at the picture, the edges of my jaw tightening. That's a felony, she nodded. We've already filed charges for unauthorized surveillance, criminal mischief, and document forgery. The DA's office is building a conspiracy case. I walked out of the precinct into a gust of cold wind that somehow felt earned. Back home, the barn looked untouched, bright, defiant, but my phone buzzed with a new email as I stepped onto the porch. Subject: Emergency Community Meeting HOA Suspension Hearing the Body read. Due to recent allegations and evidence presented to local authorities, a special temporary council has been formed to oversee the dismantling of Ridgeview HOA's current leadership. All residents are encouraged to attend. The meeting was set for Friday night in the community center's gymnasium. I showed up early. Rows of folding chairs filled the polished floor, and the room buzzed with voices that hadn't mingled in years. I recognized familiar faces from front porches and driveways, people I'd nodded to for years, but never really spoken with. Marcus waved me over. Tasha sat beside him, clipboard in her lap. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Not really," I said. "But I'm showing up." When the makeshift council called the meeting to order, the lights dimmed and a projector flicked on. Detective Velez stepped onto the stage and addressed the crowd. "We're here tonight not just because of a barn," she began. "We're here because your community leadership violated your trust. They turned a neighborhood into a surveillance state." She clicked through slides, images of forged petitions, timestamps from hidden cameras, copies of the fake cease and desist letters. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people stood up, shaking their heads. "We've arrested 3 individuals connected to this operation. A 4th is cooperating as a witness. The HOA's finances are frozen. All enforcement activities are suspended indefinitely." A man in the back shouted, "What happens to our dues?" Velez nodded toward a woman in a tailored blazer, Cynthia Morgan, a representative from the State Housing Board. "Any dues collected through fraudulent means will be refunded," Cynthia said. "We've already initiated the audit, and any homeowner who suffered financial damages from fake liens or threats will be eligible for compensation through the restitution fund." Then she turned to face me. "Mr. Trubell, would you be willing to speak?" My throat tightened. I hadn't planned to, but my legs moved before I could think better of it. I stepped up, took the mic, and faced the crowd. "I didn't set out to fight anyone," I said. "I just wanted to build something useful on my land. Something I could be proud of." What followed wasn't about code violations. It was about control. We let someone speak for us without ever asking who gave them the right. The room stayed quiet. But the real story here isn't just what Deidra did, it's what all of us allowed by staying silent. "That ends now." I handed the mic back and walked off the stage. People clapped, not wildly, but steadily, like a tide shifting. By the end of the night, the Provisional Council voted to dissolve the Ridgeview HOA entirely. The bylaws had a clause that allowed disbandment if 2/3 of residents agreed, and thanks to the exposure, over 80% had already signed the petition. Outside, I stood under the street lamp with Helen, the retired teacher, and Rob, the mechanic. We watched as Deidra was led out the side door of the gymnasium, hands cuffed, flanked by 2 deputies. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but no one stepped forward. No one defended her. No one even looked surprised. Rob shook his head. "All that trouble just to play queen of the cul-de-sac." Helen pulled her scarf tighter. "She ran it like a fiefdom, but this isn't medieval England." I walked home in the cold, hands in my jacket pockets. The barn stood in the moonlight, solid and still. I stood there a moment, letting the air settle. The next morning, I opened my mailbox to find a single envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Marcus and Tasha. "Thanks for standing up when no one else would. We're building a chicken coop this spring. Mind lending a hand?" I looked out at the barn, smiled to myself, and went inside to grab my toolbox. 4 weeks after the HOA's collapse, the last of the Ridgeview signs came down. The neighborhood entrance, once framed by neatly trimmed hedges and a brick pillar bearing the HOA's crest, now looked bare. Honest, even, no one missed it. I was on the roof of the barn installing a new weather vane when Cynthia Morgan from the housing board pulled up in a state vehicle, stepped out in a navy coat, and waved. "I thought you'd like to see the final audit results," she said, handing me a folder. The board voted unanimously to make them public. I climbed down the ladder and flipped through the pages. The numbers were staggering. Deidra had diverted over $27,000 of HOA funds into a personal account labeled Community Enhancements. Most of it went to private contractors who couldn't be located, likely shell companies she created with phony invoices. The shell companies were traced to a P.O. box in her maiden name, Cynthia said. She'd been laundering dues for almost 4 years. The surveillance gear, fake legal letters, even the signs at the entrance all paid through those accounts. "She ran it like a cartel," I muttered. She tried to. The DA's office filed additional charges last Friday: wire fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful surveillance. She'll be facing federal court now. Do the residents get anything back? We're working on that. The insurance bond will cover about half. The rest depends on asset recovery. If the judge rules in favor of restitution, her house and vehicle are on the table. I looked up at the barn's freshly painted trim. "She tried to destroy people's lives over a patch of land," Cynthia nodded. "And she underestimated what happens when a community stops being afraid." That night, I went to a bonfire gathering hosted by Rob, the mechanic. He'd cleared out the old HOA meeting shed behind his garage and converted it into a neighborhood tool library. A handwritten chalk sign hung by the open door. "No dues, just do." People brought chairs, crockpots, and coolers. Helen played guitar on the porch while Marcus grilled venison steaks. Tasha organized a little raffle to raise funds for a new park bench near the walking trail. Nobody was in charge. Nobody needed to be. Midway through the evening, Officer Griggs from the sheriff's department showed up in jeans and a windbreaker, holding a tray of cornbread. "You're off duty?" I asked, handing him a plate. "Mostly, just wanted to thank you." He nodded toward the crowd. "This could have gone a very different way. Truth is, most people fold when they're threatened. You didn't." "I almost did," I admitted, before I realized how many people had stories like mine. He looked around at the firelit faces. "You know, we got a tip from a resident that Deidra kept a backup drive locked in her attic. Encryption was a joke, just her cat's name backwards. That's where we found the original petition template she used to forge signatures. Even had practice scans of different handwriting styles." I raised an eyebrow. "So she rehearsed forgery?" Had a spreadsheet of who she thought wouldn't notice. Elderly, part-timers, folks who didn't open mail regularly. She built a system. The fire crackled behind us. Kids ran past with glow sticks. Someone popped open a second cooler. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Federal sentencing's in 6 months. She's looking at 10 to 15 years minimum, no parole on wire fraud." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You set it all in motion." "Don't forget that." The following morning, I poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter I just received from the county clerk. It wasn't bad news this time. It confirmed that my property remained independent and could not be annexed into any future HOA without a unanimous vote of the entire street. A new protection clause had been added after the investigation. Attached was a second letter, this one from the state attorney general's office. It awarded me a community advocacy citation. I chuckled, folded it, and slid it into a drawer I rarely used. 2 weeks later, Marcus and Tasha's chicken coop was nearly done. I helped raise the frame and secure the mesh walls. They'd named their first hen Deidra. She was the loudest, strutted like she owned the yard, and laid eggs on her own schedule. "Irony's poetic sometimes," I said, pouring seed into the feeder. Marcus grinned. "She tries to peck the others, but they don't put up with it anymore." As spring rolled in and the dogwoods bloomed, the neighborhood started to look less like a collection of houses and more like a place people chose to be. Rob hosted a tool workshop on Saturdays. Helen ran a gardening club from her backyard. Even the grumpiest guy on the block, Mr. Kim, started leaving spare vegetables on doorsteps. One evening, I found a note tucked under a jar of local honey left on my porch. No name, just a line scribbled in tidy cursive. Thanks for reminding us that property lines don't divide neighbors, fear does. I kept that one, framed it even. By the time summer arrived, the barn had become a landmark, not because it was big or flashy, but because it stood for something. People stopped by to borrow tools, ask about solar panels, or just talk, and no one ever asked if it violated code again, because now everyone knew it didn't, and never had.